To understand the horror of the Banzai Charge, you first have to understand where it happened. You have to strip away the comfort of the modern world and transport yourself back to August 1942. The place is Guadalcanal, a rotting, malaria-infested island in the South Pacific that the Marines called the Green Hell. Imagine you are 19 years old. You are thousands of miles from home, sitting in a hole dug into the black mud. The air is so thick with humidity that it feels like you are breathing soup. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of rotting coconuts, decaying vegetation, and the faint metallic scent of rusted iron. It is 2 a.m. The jungle is pitch black. This isn't the darkness of a city at night. It is a primal, suffocating darkness where you cannot see the end of your own rifle barrel. For the last 3 nights, you haven't slept. Not really. Because out there, beyond the wire, the jungle is alive. You can hear them. The Japanese soldiers are masters of the night. They are crawling through the tall kunai grass, inch by inch, silent as ghosts. Sometimes, just to break your mind, they yell insults from the darkness in broken English. They rattle tin cans on the barbed wire. They want you to fire. They want you to reveal your position. They want you terrified. The fear on the line is palpable. It is a physical weight pressing down on every man's chest. The rumors have been spreading through the platoon for days. They say the Japanese are not like normal soldiers. They say they are supermen who can see in the dark, jungle spirits who cannot be killed by normal bullets. They say they don't surrender. They say they enjoy torture. Every Marine gripping his Springfield rifle tightens his knuckles until they turn white. They are waiting for the inevitable. And then, the silence breaks. It doesn't start with a gunshot. It starts with a signal flare popping high into the overcast sky. It burns with an eerie chemical green light, casting long, dancing shadows across the sandbar of the Tenno River. For a split second, the scene is illuminated like a photograph from hell, and what the Marines see freezes the blood in their veins. Emerging from the tree line, hundreds of yards away, is not a tactical formation. It is a tidal wave. Hundreds of men, officers in the front, waving gleaming katana swords above their heads, screaming orders that sound like barks. Behind them, a mass of infantry, bayonets fixed on their Arisaka rifles, creating a forest of steel points. And then comes the sound. Tenno Heika Banzai! The scream rises from hundreds of throats simultaneously, a deafening roar that drowns out the sound of the surf crashing on the beach. It is a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. It is the sound of men who have already accepted they are dead. The Marine machine gunners on the sandbar hesitate for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sheer audacity of it. The Japanese are not taking cover. They are not flanking. They are running straight into the kill zone. They are running directly into the barrels of the .30 caliber, water-cooled Browning machine guns. Then, the Americans open up. The noise becomes deafening. The heavy machine guns begin to hammer, a rhythmic mechanical thumping that shakes the ground. Tracers tear through the night air like angry hornets. The front row of the Japanese charge is simply erased. Bodies are ripped apart by the heavy caliber rounds. Arms, legs, and chests disintegrate under the impact. The first wave falls into the sand, turning the river mouth red. But then, the impossible happens. The charge does not stop. In any other war, in any other army, seeing 50 of your friends shredded in seconds would make you turn back. It would make you dive for cover. But the Japanese keep coming. They step over the bodies of the dead. They climb over the piles of corpses as if they are sandbags. They are screaming, eyes wide, faces twisted in a rictus of hate. They run through the wall of lead. A Marine loader watches in horror as a Japanese soldier, shot 3 times in the chest, keeps running for another 10 yards before finally collapsing. Another soldier, his arm blown off by a grenade, stands up and tries to charge with a knife in his remaining hand. It looks less like a military attack and more like a zombie horde. It is relentless. It is terrifying. It is inhuman. For the young Americans, this was a collision of 2 worlds. They were fighting a 20th century war with machine guns and artillery. The enemy was fighting a medieval war with spirit and flesh. As the night dragged on and the barrels of the machine guns glowed red-hot from continuous fire, a single question burned in the minds of the survivors. a question that would haunt the entire Pacific War. What kind of army teaches its men to die like this? What kind of belief system can turn a human being into a weapon that only works when it is destroyed? To understand this madness, we have to look away from the blood-soaked sands of Guadalcanal. We have to look back into the history of an isolated island nation and a code of honor that was twisted into a suicide pact. To the Americans staring out from their foxholes, the enemy appeared to be a mindless horde, a swarm of fanatics with no regard for self-preservation. But this was a dangerous oversimplification. The men charging into the fire were not mindless. In fact, their minds had been carefully, methodically, and brutally engineered for exactly this moment since the day they were born. To understand the suicide charge, we cannot look at military manuals. We must look at the soul of a nation that trapped itself in a prison of its own history. For centuries, Japan was ruled by the samurai class. These were the elite warriors, the knights of the East, who lived and died by a strict moral code known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido was a complex philosophy. It valued loyalty, martial skill, and honor above all else. In this ancient world, death was not something to be feared, it was something to be mastered. If a samurai failed his lord, or faced the humiliation of capture, he had a way out. He could commit seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment. By taking his own life, he washed away the shame and died with his honor intact. But here is the crucial distinction that history often forgets. Bushido was a code for the elite. It was reserved for the aristocracy of the sword. The rice farmers, the merchants, and the fishermen, the common people of Japan, were never expected to die by their own hand. They were expected to live, work, and pay taxes. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Japan rushed to modernize and become a global superpower, something dark and transformative happened. The military government decided to democratize death. The generals and admirals of the new Imperial Army hijacked the ancient code of the samurai. They took these noble, feudal ideals and twisted them into a tool for mass control. They created a new state-sponsored religion where the emperor was a living god, and every single Japanese male, regardless of whether he was born in a palace or a mud hut, was told that he was a warrior. They told the peasant boy that he carried the spirit of the samurai in his blood, and that his highest calling was to shatter his body like a jewel for the emperor. This indoctrination started in kindergarten. Japanese children were not just taught math and reading, they were taught the ethics of loyalty. They were taught that the individual is nothing, a speck of dust, and the state is everything. By the time a boy was drafted into the army, his mind was already primed. Then came the training. Japanese basic training was notorious for its brutality. It was designed to break the recruit's ego completely. Officers would beat soldiers for the smallest infractions. They would slap them, humiliate them, and force them to stand for hours in the sun. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If you could endure the beatings of your own officers, you would not fear the bullets of the enemy. If you surrendered your individuality to your sergeant, you would surrender your life to the emperor without hesitation. But the final lock on this psychological cage was placed in 1941 by General Hideki Tojo himself. It was a small booklet called the Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code. Every soldier was required to carry it. Every soldier had to memorize it. And inside, there was one sentence that would doom hundreds of thousands of men to unnecessary deaths. It read, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you." This was the law. Surrender was not just illegal, it was impossible. In the Japanese military worldview, there was no protocol for being captured. There were no instructions on how to behave as a POW, because a Japanese soldier was not supposed to exist as a POW. So, when those men stood on the edge of the Tenaru River in Guadalcanal, starving, wounded, and outnumbered, they looked at the American lines and saw only two options. They could surrender, and in doing so become non-humans, ghosts who had betrayed their ancestors, shamed their families, and committed a crime against their god-emperor. Or they could charge. They could run straight into the machine guns. They would die, yes, but they would die as guardian spirits of the nation. They would be enshrined at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, worshipped by future generations. Between the hell of shame and the hell of death, they chose death. The Banzai was not a scream of anger, it was a scream of relief. It was the sound of men escaping the impossible pressure of their own culture. They were charging because, in their minds, they were already dead. The machine guns were just the mechanism that made it official. It is easy for us, sitting in the safety of the 21st century, to dismiss the Banzai Charge as pure madness. We look at the statistics, hundreds of men dying to kill a handful of enemies, and we see only waste. But in the minds of the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo, this was not madness. It was a proven strategy. It was a doctrine built on a dangerous cocktail of arrogance and racism that had intoxicated the entire Japanese military hierarchy. For the first 6 months of the war, the Japanese army seemed invincible. They had swept across the Pacific like a wildfire. They had humiliated the British in Singapore, crushed the Dutch in the East Indies, and routed the Americans in the Philippines. In every one of these campaigns, the shock tactic had worked. The Japanese infantrymen, moving fast, light and aggressive, had terrified the colonial armies of the West. They believed they had discovered a fundamental truth about warfare, that Western soldiers were soft. The Japanese leadership was convinced that Americans were weak, corrupted by capitalism, jazz music, and democracy. They viewed the average U.S. Marine not as a warrior, but as a pampered civilian in a uniform who was too fond of his car and his comforts. They genuinely believed that these soft Westerners lacked the spiritual stamina to endure terror. They calculated that if a Japanese soldier showed enough ferocity, if he demonstrated that he was willing to die, the American soldier would panic. He would drop his rifle and run. This belief was known as the victory disease. It was a delusion of superiority that blinded them to the cold, hard mathematics of modern combat. The Japanese doctrine relied heavily on the night attack. They knew they could not match American artillery or air power during the day, so they owned the night. They trained to move silently in the dark, to communicate with crickets and whistles, to infiltrate deep into enemy lines, and then unleash a sudden, overwhelming wave of violence at close quarters. The plan was always the same. Get close enough to use the bayonet. The Arisaka Type 99 rifle was long, and when fitted with its 15-inch bayonet, it became a spear nearly 5 feet in length. In a trench fight, it was a terrifying weapon. But there was a fatal flaw in this logic. They were applying 19th century thinking to a 20th century battlefield. While Japan was forging spirits, America was forging machines. The United States Marines dug into the mud of Guadalcanal were not holding bolt-action rifles like the British in WWI. They were armed with the M1 Garand. It was the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle in history. Air Marine didn't have to work a bolt between shots. He could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. This technological gap changed the physics of the charge. Against a bolt-action army, a Banzai charge might overwhelm the defenders while they were reloading. But against a perimeter of M1 Garands, backed by bar automatic rifles and water-cooled machine guns, the charge was mathematically doomed. The wall of lead that the Americans could put into the air was impenetrable. So when the Japanese officers raised their swords and screamed the order to charge, they weren't just sending their men to die, they were sending them into a technological meat grinder. They were betting that their spiritual power could stop a .30 caliber bullet, traveling at 2,800 feet per second. It was a collision between a medieval mindset and industrial mass production. And as the bodies began to pile up in front of the American lines, the tragic reality became clear. The Americans were not running, they were not panicking, they were reloading. The theory of the invincible spiritual charge faced its first true test on the sandbar of the Tenno River. It was here that Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a man so confident in victory that he had brought his dress uniform to wear for the surrender ceremony, learned the brutal lesson of modern firepower. Ichiki did not wait for his full force to arrive. He did not scout the American positions. He looked at the map, saw a thin line of Marines, and assumed that a single violent shove would break them. At 3 a.m., he blew his whistle. The first wave of the Ichiki detachment surged forward out of the coconut grove. They hit the single strand of barbed wire the Marines had strung across the sandbar. They didn't cut it, they tried to trample it. What happened next was not a battle. It was an execution. The Marines didn't just have rifles. Sitting in the dark, camouflaged by palm fronds, were 37mm anti-tank guns. These cannons were designed to punch through the armor of tanks, but on this night they were loaded with canister shot. Imagine a shotgun shell the size of a milk bottle, packed with hundreds of steel balls. When the Japanese wave hit the wire, the Marines pulled the lanyards on the cannons. The effect was devastating. The canister rounds turned the cannons into giant industrial shotguns. Each blast sprayed a cone of steel that didn't just kill men, it erased them. The front ranks of the Japanese charge simply evaporated into a red mist. But the horror of the Banzai Charge is that it doesn't stop when the dying starts. It feeds on it. The second wave of Japanese soldiers ran into the backs of the first wave. They tripped over the bodies of their comrades, screaming, firing blindly into the dark. The pile of corpses on the sandbar began to grow so high that it actually blocked the line of fire for the Marine machine gunners. The Americans had to stand up in their foxholes to shoot over the wall of dead flesh that was building up in front of them. For the Marines, the experience was traumatic in a way that training could never prepare them for. They were firing their weapons until the barrels glowed white-hot in the night, literally melting the rifling inside the guns. Loaders were pouring water and oil onto the machine guns to keep them from seizing up. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, burning oil, and blood. And yet, Colonel Ichiki kept sending them. He sent his B Company, then his C Company. He fed his regiment into the grinder piece by piece, refusing to retreat, refusing to maneuver. He was paralyzed by his own doctrine. To stop the attack would be to admit that the spirit had failed. So he doubled down on the catastrophe. By dawn, the firing finally died down. The sun rose over a scene that looked like the end of the world. The sandbar at the mouth of the river was no longer white. It was carpeted in khaki uniforms. The tide was washing the bodies out to sea, and sharks were already circling in the surf. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the magnitude of his failure, walked quietly into the jungle. He found a small clearing, burned his regimental flag so it wouldn't be captured, and then drew his sword. He committed ritual suicide, leaving behind 800 of his men dead on the beach. The Battle of the Tenno was over. But the lesson was not learned. Tokyo did not look at this disaster and think, "Our tactics are wrong." They thought, "We didn't use enough men." They didn't blame the suicidal nature of the charge. They blamed the lack of spirit. And so, instead of stopping the madness, they decided to scale it up. The Tenno was just the opening act. The real horror was yet to come. After the slaughter at the Tenno River, the war in the Pacific shifted. The element of surprise, the terrifying shock of the Banzai Charge, was gone. The Americans now understood exactly what they were fighting. They realized that their enemy was not bound by the rules of survival, but by the rules of sacrifice. And with that knowledge, the US Marines turned the jungle into a mathematical trap. The American commanders realized that the Banzai Charge was predictable. It was almost always launched at night. It was almost always preceded by a lot of noise, and it almost always followed the path of least resistance. So, the Marines stopped trying to outfight the Japanese man-to-man. They started to outthink them with geometry. They developed what they called interlocking fields of fire. They positioned their heavy machine guns in a crisscross pattern. Gun A didn't shoot straight ahead. It shot diagonally across the front of Gun B, and Gun B shot across the front of Gun A. This created an X of bullets in the air, a kill zone where nothing could survive. When the sun went down, the Marines didn't just sit and wait anymore. They pre-sighted their artillery. They measured the exact distance to every tree line and every ridge. They turned the battlefield into a grid. When the Japanese screamed Banzai and surged forward, the Marines didn't panic. They simply picked up the phone. Seconds later, thousands of high-explosive shells would rain down on specific coordinates. The Japanese soldiers were often dead before they even saw the American lines. They were torn apart by invisible explosions in the dark. The war had become industrial. It was no longer a test of courage, it was a test of ballistics. But for the Japanese soldiers caught in this trap, the horror was absolute. Diaries found on dead bodies tell a story of utter despair. They knew the charge was futile. They knew the American firepower was overwhelming, Yet, they were trapped in a social machinery they couldn't escape. An officer would draw his sword, and the social pressure to follow him was stronger than the biological instinct to live. As the war moved closer to Japan, to islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, the Banzai Charge evolved into something even darker. It ceased to be a military tactic designed to win a battle. It became a ritual designed to end a life. The goal was no longer to break the American line. The goal was to avoid the shame of surviving. The Americans noticed the change. The charges became less organized and more frantic. They started seeing men charging with nothing but grenades held against their chests. They saw officers running into machine gun fire armed only with a flag. It was a descent into madness, and it would culminate in the single most horrific night of the entire war, a night where an entire army decided to commit mass suicide, on a scale that the world had never seen before. While the jungles of Guadalcanal were steaming in the heat, another tragedy was unfolding on the other side of the world, a tragedy that is often forgotten in the history books, but which proves that the madness of the Banzai Charge knew no climate and no geography. We must travel north, to the frozen, wind-swept islands of the Aleutians off the coast of Alaska. It is May 1943, the Battle of Attu. This was the only land battle of World War II fought on North American soil. The conditions were apocalyptic, a landscape of volcanic rock, freezing mud, and eternal fog. The American soldiers were suffering from frostbite and trench foot. The Japanese defenders, led by Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, were starving. They had been cut off from Japan for weeks. They had no food, no artillery shells, and no hope of rescue. By May 29th, Colonel Yamasaki had only 1,000 men left out of his original 2,600. He knew the end was near. According to Western logic, this was the moment to surrender. His men had fought bravely. They had held off a superior American force for weeks. But Yamasaki was a prisoner of the code. He issued a final order that chilled the blood of everyone who read it later. He ordered the sick and wounded in his field hospital to be killed. Those who couldn't walk were given hand grenades to blow themselves up, or were injected with morphine and finished off by doctors. Once the burden of the wounded was removed, Yamasaki gathered his remaining able-bodied men. But this was not a military formation. It was a mob of desperate, starving men. At 3 a.m., under the cover of a dense Arctic fog, they began to move. They didn't attack the combat troops on the front line. They slipped through the gaps in the American defense and headed straight for the rear. They were heading for the supply tents and the field hospitals. What happened next was a massacre straight out of a horror movie. American cooks, mechanics, and doctors, sleeping in their tents in the rear area, suddenly woke up to the sound of screaming men tearing through the canvas. The Japanese soldiers, wild-eyed and emaciated, burst into the medical tents. They bayoneted men in their sleeping bags. They smashed medical equipment. It was a frenzy of violence fueled by starvation and despair. An American doctor, seeing the horde approaching, grabbed a pistol and defended his patients until he ran out of ammunition, only to be cut down by swords. The chaos was absolute. It took hours for the American combat troops to realize what was happening behind them and turn around to fight. When the sun finally rose over the gray rocks of Attu, the valley was silent. The Japanese charge had been wiped out. But the end of the battle was even more disturbing. As the Americans advanced to check the bodies, they saw that hundreds of Japanese soldiers were holding grenades against their own chests. They had pulled the pins rather than be captured. Colonel Yamasaki was found dead, sword in hand. The Battle of Attu revealed a terrifying truth to the American High Command. The Banzai Charge wasn't just a jungle tactic. It wasn't just something that happened in the heat of the moment. It was a fundamental pathology of the Japanese army. It didn't matter if they were burning in the tropics or freezing in the Arctic. The result was always the same: total self-destruction. By the summer of 1944, the American war machine had reached the Mariana Islands. The target was Saipan. But Saipan was different from Guadalcanal or Attu. It wasn't just a military garrison. It was a home. Thousands of Japanese civilians lived there. Farmers, shopkeepers, families with small children. And this is where the doctrine of death before surrender crossed the line from military strategy into absolute societal madness. For months before the invasion, The Japanese propaganda machine had been poisoning the minds of these civilians. They were told that the Americans were not human. They were told that the U.S. Marines were foreign devils who would rape the women, torture the men, and eat the children. The government issued a terrified population with hand grenades and potassium cyanide. They were told, "If the Americans come, you must purify yourselves." When the U.S. Marines landed, they expected a fight with soldiers. They did not expect to witness the mass suicide of an entire population. As the Americans pushed north, herding the retreating Japanese towards the edge of the island, they reached a place now known as Mapi Point. There, two high cliffs dropped 800 feet straight down into the jagged rocks and the churning ocean below. Today they are called Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. On July 9th, American interpreters armed with loudspeakers crawled to the edge of the lines. They pleaded in Japanese, "Do not jump. We will give you food. We will give you water. We will not hurt you." They even sent captured Japanese civilians who had been treated kindly to talk to their friends on the cliff edge, begging them to turn back. But the fear was too deep. The indoctrination was too strong. From the American ships offshore, sailors watched through binoculars with tears streaming down their faces. They saw horrific scenes that no amount of training could prepare them for. They saw mothers combing their daughters' hair for the last time, tying it back with ribbons. Then they watched as those mothers picked up their children and threw them over the edge, leaping after them a second later. They saw entire families holding hands, grandparents, parents, and toddlers, walking calmly off the ledge into the abyss. They saw young women jumping while clutching grenades to their chests, exploding before they even hit the water. The ocean below turned red. The sound of bodies hitting the rocks was so loud it could be heard over the wind. One Marine veteran later recalled watching a father throw his 3 children one by one off the cliff. The man hesitated for a moment, looked back at the Americans who were shouting, "Don't do it," and then jumped himself. In just a few days, over 1,000 civilians perished on those rocks. This moment broke something in the soul of the war. The American soldiers realized they were fighting an enemy that had completely divorced itself from the basic human instinct of survival. But for the Japanese soldiers watching from the caves nearby, this sight had a different effect. They didn't see tragedy. They saw martyrdom. They saw their wives and children choosing death over the shame of being captured by the white devils. And this sight stripped away their last shred of humanity. If their families were dead, what was the point of living? The suicide of the civilians removed the last anchor holding the soldiers to reality. It was this psychological snap, this total loss of hope, that set the stage for what would happen next. General Saito, sitting in his cave, knew that his civilians were gone, his army was starving. The time for tactics was over. The time for the end had come. And so, he began to organize the final act of the tragedy. If Guadalcanal was a tragedy, Saipan was the apocalypse. By July 1944, the situation for the Japanese defenders on the island of Saipan was hopeless. They had been pushed back to the northern tip of the island. They were starving, cut off from supply lines, and being pounded day and night by American naval artillery. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, an aging cavalry officer, knew the end had come. But surrender was still a word that did not exist in his vocabulary. On the evening of July 6th, inside a humid, cramped cave that served as his headquarters, Saito ate a final meal of sake and canned crab meat. He then issued his last proclamation to the 5,000 ragged survivors of his army. "Whether we attack, or whether we stay where we are, there is only death," he wrote. "However, in death there is life. I will advance with you to deliver another blow to the American devils." After issuing the order, General Saito did not lead the charge. He walked to a corner of the cave, sat down facing north towards the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, and cut his own arteries with a sword while his adjutant shot him in the head. But his order remained. And what gathered in the darkness that night was not an army. It was a parade of the damned. At 04:02 a.m. on July 7th, the Americans of the 105th Infantry Regiment heard a low rumble. It sounded like a landslide. But as the sound got closer, it separated into thousands of screaming voices. Then they saw them. Emerging from the fog and smoke was the largest Banzai Charge of the Pacific War, over 4,000 men. But these were not the elite shock troops of 1942. Leading the charge were the able-bodied soldiers, but behind them came the walking ghosts. Men wrapped in bloody bandages, men hobbling on makeshift crutches made of tree branches, soldiers who were blind being led by their comrades. Some didn't even have rifles. They carried rocks, bayonets tied to bamboo poles or just rusted knives. It was a scene of utter nightmare. The Americans fired their machine guns, mowing down rows of men, but the sheer mass of the charge was unstoppable. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with a spoon. The Japanese poured over the American foxholes, not using tactics, but simply smothering the defenders with their bodies. They overran the front lines. They overran the command posts. They surged all the way back to the artillery batteries in the rear. Gunners of the 10th Marine Regiment were forced to cut the fuses on their shells to nearly zero, firing high-explosive rounds point-blank into the faces of the charging mob. When the shells ran out, the artillerymen removed the firing locks from their cannons and fought the Japanese with pistols, wrenches, and bare hands. For 15 hours, the battle raged. It was a chaotic, primitive brawl where rank and strategy meant nothing. By the time the sun set on July the 7th, the charge was over. The silence returned to Saipan, but the landscape had been permanently altered. In front of the American lines, the bodies of the Japanese attackers were piled so high that American patrols couldn't walk without stepping on them. They counted 4,300 dead Japanese bodies in that small sector alone. The 105th Infantry had suffered heavy casualties, but they had held. The Gyokusai of Saipan, the shattering of the jewel, was complete. The Japanese garrison had destroyed itself, but for the Americans standing amidst the carnage, looking at the bodies of crippled men who had dragged themselves miles just to die, a terrifying realization set in. If the Japanese would do this on a remote island, what would they do when the war reached their homeland? When the smoke finally cleared over the islands of the Pacific, the true cost of the Banzai Charge became visible. It wasn't just measured in the mountains of corpses rotting in the tropical sun. It was measured in the emptiness that followed. By relying on this tactic, the Imperial Japanese Army had committed a slow, agonizing form of suicide. They hadn't just thrown away soldiers, they had thrown away their future. In the early years of the war, the men who led these charges, the sergeants, the lieutenants, the captains, were the backbone of the army. They were veterans of China, hardened warriors with years of experience. When they died screaming on the wire at Guadalcanal or Saipan, they took that experience with them. They left behind an army of raw conscripts, terrified teenagers, and old men who had no one to lead them. The spirit that Tokyo prized so highly had cannibalized the army's brain. By 1945, the Japanese military was a hollow shell. They had traded their best men for nothing. Strategically, the Banzai Charge achieved absolutely zero. It never turned the tide of a major battle. It never recaptured a significant island. It never stopped the American fleet. All it did was speed up the inevitable defeat. But the tragedy goes deeper than military strategy. It speaks to the utter betrayal of the Japanese soldier by his own government. These men were not monsters by nature. They were farmers from Hiroshima, students from Tokyo, fishermen from Okinawa. They wrote letters home to their mothers. They carried photos of their children in their pockets. They were human beings who were systematically brainwashed into believing that their lives were worthless currency, to be spent cheaply by generals sitting in comfortable bunkers thousands of miles away. The Banzai Charge paved the way for the final descent into darkness, the kamikaze. The logic that justified charging a machine gun with a bayonet was the exact same logic that justified flying a plane into a battleship. It was the ultimate expression of a regime that had run out of ideas, run out of hope, and had nothing left to offer but the blood of its youth. As the Americans moved closer to the Japanese mainland, they stopped seeing the Banzai Charge as an act of war. They began to see it as a symptom of a national sickness. They realized they weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting a death cult. And this realization terrified them more than any weapon, because if an enemy is willing to do this to themselves, what will they do when you step foot on their sacred soil? The Banzai Charge ensured that the war would not end with a handshake, but with total, absolute annihilation. By late 1944, the Japanese High Command had to accept a bitter truth. The Banzai Charge on land was failing. The human bullet attacks were being mowed down by American machine guns before they could even get close enough to use their bayonets. The exchange rate was disastrous. But instead of questioning the morality of suicide tactics, the generals decided to mechanize them. If a soldier couldn't run fast enough to hit the enemy, they would put him inside a machine that could. This birthed one of the darkest chapters in naval engineering, the kaiten. The word means return to heaven, but the reality was a metal coffin submerged in the cold depths of the Pacific. The kaiten was not a submarine. It was a modified Type 93 long-lance torpedo, a massive cylinder of explosives. Engineers stripped out the guidance systems and installed a small cramped cockpit for a human pilot. Inside, there was a periscope, a few crude controls, and a button to detonate the 3,000-pound warhead. But there was one thing the engineers deliberately left out: an escape hatch. Once the pilot climbed in and the hatch was bolted shut from the outside, he was already dead. There was no way out. He was fused with the weapon. The training for the kaiten pilots was intense and spiritual. They were often young men, barely 20 years old, who were told they were gods in human form. They would be launched from the deck of a mother submarine, miles away from the American fleet. Alone in the darkness of the ocean, struggling to breathe the stale air, they had to steer their torpedo towards the hulls of American ships. But the tragedy of the kaiten was identical to the tragedy of the Banzai Charge on land. It didn't work. The weapon was flawed. The navigation was impossible. Many pilots suffocated before finding a target. Others hit reefs or exploded prematurely. Out of hundreds of launches, only a handful of American ships were sunk. These iron coffins represent the final desperate evolution of the Banzai mentality. It proved that the Japanese military was no longer fighting to win strategic victories. They were building an entire industry of death, forging steel not to protect their soldiers, but to consume them. The Banzai Charge had moved from the jungle to the ocean floor, but the result was the same: young men dying in the dark, believing they were saving a world that had already abandoned them. Today, if you walk the black sands of Iwo Jima or the overgrown jungle trails of Guadalcanal, the silence is heavy. The screams have faded. The smell of cordite is gone. All that remains are the rusted skeletons of helmets, canteens, and the occasional bleached bone rising from the earth. But the echo of the Banzai remains. It stands as one of history's most terrifying warnings. It shows us what happens when a culture values a symbol more than a human life. It shows us the terrifying power of indoctrination, how easily the instinct for survival can be overwritten by the demand for conformity. The men who charged into the machine guns were not demons. They were sons, husbands, and fathers who were forged by their nation into instruments of death. They believed they were buying honor with their blood, but history suggests they bought nothing but a quicker defeat. As we look back at the Pacific War, we are left with a difficult question. When you see a soldier charging into certain death, do you see the ultimate act of bravery? Or do you see the tragic victim of a government that had lost its mind? What do you think? Was the Banzai Charge a display of warrior spirit, or a crime against the soldiers who were ordered to do it? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to understand the machines and the minds that forged the Second World War, make sure to subscribe to the War Forge. Join us next time as we uncover the secrets buried beneath the battlefield. Thanks for watching,